Welcome to NucleCast, the official podcast of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Each week, we bring you leading experts for a lively discussion on topics related to strategic nuclear deterrence. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, Director of Strategic Programs at the National Strategic Research Institute. The views of the hosts and the guests are their own.
Hey, and welcome into the latest episode of NucleCast. Now, we have a very special guest today. You I shouldn't say may, you will definitely remember former Congressman Matt Thornberry, who was the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee and a longtime, 26 years, longtime member of Congress. And if you saw his list of awards for his service in Congress, you would be jealous. So I want to welcome former Congressman Thornberry to NucleCast as we talk about some really interesting and contemporary topics for today. Well, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Adam. I appreciate you having me.
It's good to be here, and it's always good to have a fellow Texan on the show. I think the rest of the country is lucky that we're still part of the Union. And I feel they're very lucky to have us. So it's always good to spread our wisdom to the other 49 states.
Exactly. So, we need to make them more like us.
Amen, brother. Amen. How could you go wrong by having everybody be Texan? I just don't see the problem there. Now, we just had, it's been a month and a half or so, and we had a nuclear posture review. And in your time in the House, you've seen many nuclear posture reviews. So as you look at the latest NPR and sort of give your thoughts to what it means and what you see it doing in the long term, how it might shape the enterprise, as you think through it, what's your thoughts on this most recent nuclear posture review?
Well, I would say first, I'm kind of relieved that it continues to emphasize modernization of our nuclear deterrent. We have, as you know, a lot of programs going on, and those need to continue, and that is supported largely by this approach. As you also know, it is this whole idea, not only in the nuclear posture review, but in the national security strategy of integrated deterrence and what that means and how does that relate to a strong nuclear deterrent is somewhat controversial, because there's some people who see that as kind of code words for putting less emphasis on the nuclear deterrent and relying on other things more. And, I think all of us agree you need to have all of the tools available to you to protect American national security, but there's still some uneasiness about what that phrase and what that approach will mean when it comes to our nuclear deterrence.
Yeah, one thing that, based on what you just said, I've been giving some thought to integrated deterrence. And the way I have seen it is that it appears that the administration is mistaking grand strategy for deterrence, because really integrated deterrence, it's national grand strategy. It takes the aspirations of the nation and all of the means of national power and applies them to it. So it's not actually a deterrence strategy. Deterrence is an outcome. It's an effect you achieve as opposed to a strategy in and of itself. And I think you're right in this concern. And I don't even know if it's it's pretty implicit that the administration wants to rely less on nuclear weapons. It says so.
Yeah.
And I
don't know, a couple thoughts. One is sometimes these verbal signals are sent, and sometimes they're serious, and sometimes they're just throwing a constituency a bone. And I don't know. What I do know is that what matters more than any written strategy is where the money goes, where the actual programs deliver capability. And so, in my opinion, that's what you got to keep your eye on. Less about the pieces of paper, more about where the money goes.
Now, one of the things that the advocates of nuclear disarmament have consistently said is that we cannot afford to spend $1.2 trillion over the next 30 years. It's just unaffordable. And I think back to, one of my favorite examples is the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which reports that they lose about $70 billion a year to waste, fraud, and abuse. That's more than the entire nuclear enterprise costs, by quite a bit, actually. And I don't hear anybody throwing a fit over it. I bet you didn't even know that. Nobody does. But it's more than the nuclear enterprise, and nobody says, man, we got to crack down on all that waste, fraud, and abuse. But yet, somehow, this argument that it's unaffordable is believable to many Americans. And I wonder, in Congress, the House's primary responsibility is budgeting, and they begin all the budgets. So surely there's widespread understanding that nuclear weapons are not this unaffordable item that disarmament advocates claim it is.
Yeah. Well, I do think you see bipartisan support for modernizing all three legs of the triad. And you've seen it even just this week in both the House and the Senate with the votes on the defense authorization bill. So I do think it's there. And also, if you look at this, in any particular year, all of the nuclear modernization money is never more than 7% of the defense budget. So, and you consider then how important it is and how all of our other really defense efforts in protecting our country are based upon a credible nuclear deterrent. It's hard to say that, no, we can't afford 7% of the defense budget to do that, much less compared to the healthcare spending and other programs of government. So it's an argument that's used, but I take some heart that you have seen consistently support in both parties, in both houses of Congress, for this modernization of the delivery systems.
Now, as I think to modernization of the strategic triad, and we're at New START levels, we're at 1,550, and as I think strategically as a planner, I take heart if I'm putting myself in the Russian and the Chinese perspective. I'm happy that the United States is modernizing its strategic triad and canceling and not focusing on theater, like low yield theater nuclear weapons, because I, as the Russians, can fight any war I need to fight with theater nuclear weapons, because I don't ever want to get into a shooting match with the United States where ICBMs are going across the poles. But I might want to be able to use low yield, short range nuclear weapons against NATO and avoid trying to go strategic. And the United States has essentially taken itself out of that game, both in Europe and in Asia. And so I wonder if we're playing into the hands of the Russians and the Chinese by focusing solely on strategic modernization and not developing new low yield theater delivery capabilities. Am I wrong here? Is that something that we should be thinking about? And how would we get, the Congress, the administration to think about these challenges?
Yeah, now I think you're posing a harder question, because while there are bipartisan majorities in both the House and the Senate for modernization of the delivery systems, if you start to have a conversation about the weapons themselves and the characteristics of those weapons, it becomes much more controversial politically. And I think your point is exactly right. And it's really been a flaw in our arms control negotiations with the Soviet Union, now Russia, all along. That we just focus on whatever gets arbitrarily labeled as strategic weapons, and the tactical, the shorter range, the different yields that they have, and that Putin has threatened in recent weeks.
Absolutely.
That those are never even considered. And that becomes so much more problematic if you add the Chinese into the equation as well. So I think you're right. I want the U.S. to have as many options as possible. I want to complicate the calculations of Putin and Xi and North Korea and anybody else who is looking to do us harm. And that means different size weapons, different characteristics of the weapons. And we need to have that conversation. And then you have a whole nother conversation of, okay, if you decide you need a weapon that looks like this, can we do it? Because obviously we're still keeping the 1970s and 80s version of our nuclear weapons alive, thanks to some great smart people, but it can't last forever. And so the whole, can you develop a new weapon? Can you manufacture it? All of those questions also don't really get asked very much.
Yeah, so you mentioned building these weapons, and you used to represent Pantex. Pantex is a manufacturing plant, and I live in Kansas City and spend time down at the Kansas City plant. And the big challenge for within the nuclear enterprise, the manufacturing side, is that we have so many modernization programs going on that they really can't handle all of the work that there is to do. I know at Kansas City, for example, when they originally built the new facilities, which I'm sure you helped fund, they thought that there was too much floor space there and that they would never need it. But in reality, they consumed it quickly and are now in a whole bunch of other leased buildings. And so we've not been able to effectively manage for these modernization efforts. And I wonder, as you think through it and sort of look at this, how do you see us being best able for, a Russian breakout, the Chinese expansion, if we need to start actually making new warheads, additional numbers, if we need new plutonium pits, which is a big problem, how do you think we would be able to get that, through an administration, through Congress, then, build these facilities and capabilities quickly? Is that even possible?
Yeah, it's possible. And I don't mean to be simplistic, but it takes leadership. You need a president who will explain why it's needed and use his or her political power to push it through, as well as Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Energy, and so forth. And we really haven't had that. Several years ago, there was a commission that, again, looked at broad national security strategy. And one of the points they made is this industrial capacity in our nuclear enterprise is a deterrent in and of itself, because adversaries have to consider what it can do and take that into account. And it's only logical that if you don't have the ability to build new weapons or to replace pits in this case or whatever, then that encourages adversaries because it's a weakness on our side. So some of this stuff is really expensive. Probably we over-engineer some of these things, versus how we've done it in the past. But we still don't have what we need as far as the manufacturing capability to be responsive to a rapidly changing situation, much less a flaw we find in one of our existing weapons. And so, again, that's where this dynamic world situation with Russia, China, others pursuing nuclear weapons, we're not equipped to be agile enough to deal with that, I'm afraid.
Yeah, that's 100% true. And we have, for the majority of Americans, they don't really contemplate that we could have a failure across an entire class of warhead or delivery vehicle that's your, sort of your oh shit moment. And then we have to fix it. And we're just really not postured to do that. Now we're about halfway through the show. Go ahead. I'll let you take finish your statement.
No, I just wanted to go back and say, but leadership is just essential. I'm reading a book on President Reagan, and the amount of time he spent explaining to the American people what the nuclear deterrent, what they were doing, why they were doing it is remarkable. And we just haven't had that since, even though in many ways the world is more dangerous now than it even was then.
Yeah, certainly more adversaries trying to fight us in an asymmetric way. What's the book, by the way? I'm curious if I've read it.
It's recently out by Will Inboten, who teaches at the University of Texas. It's called Reagan the Peacemaker. And it's a remarkable reminder, not only on the nuclear side, but how everybody can think, oh, the country is going downhill, and one person can make a real difference.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, well, we're halfway through the show, so we're going to take a quick break. We're talking to former chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Mac Thornberry, and we'll be right back. This episode of Nuclecast is brought to you by the ANWA Deterrence Center, whose mission is to educate Americans about the nuclear enterprise and strategic deterrence. Okay, and we're back. We're talking to Mac Thornberry, former HASC chairman, and I want to shift the conversation and talk a little bit about Congress and who you see as playing that leading role. You and John Kyle and a few members were the leading voices, back in the original negotiation, A New Start, that said, hey, we'll give you this arms control treaty, but we want modernization. And so who do you see now playing that role, advocating for modernization, advocating for the kinds of capabilities we need? Who's leading in Congress, and who might step up to play critical roles in the years ahead, particularly now that we just had a midterm?
Yeah. I think there are some leaders who are or will step up to meet the need because they have this kind of broad understanding of what's important to U.S. national security. But it is true that those of us who grew up in the Cold War, and I first came to Washington as a staffer in the 1980s, were really focused on these strategic nuclear issues. And for people who have come to Congress in the last couple decades, it hasn't been that much of a front burner sort of concern. So that's a long way of saying one of the things we need to do, in my opinion, is to reinvigorate the kind of strategic study and thinking and discussion about these issues. Now, hopefully Putin's kind of helped motivate us a little bit on that, but in Congress and in think tanks and in, all around the national security community, we need to work more on these issues. I think in the Senate, Senator Deb Fischer from Nebraska has really been a good leader on strategic issues. In the House, he's working on a lot of things, but Congressman Mike Gallagher from Wisconsin is very thoughtful, understands the bigger picture, and he's one not only now but in the future. I think can be a real leader. And one other I'll mention in the House, Congressman Mike Turner, who's going to be the chairman of the Intelligence Committee. For many years was the chairman of our strategic subcommittee on armed services. And so he understands not only our programs, but what the other guys are doing too. And so I think his voice will be influential in the House.
Now, I used to, I spent most of my career with the Air Force and would spend time on the Hill talking to staffers and members about strategic issues. And I often found that your average MLA is for a member on the House side is quite young. They're a college graduate. Maybe they did an internship and then now they're back for a full-time job, and they tend not to have a lot of experience or knowledge. And members sitting on committees worrying about constituent issues oftentimes don't, if they don't have something big in their district, are not really well versed in nuclear issues. If you were to give advice to those of us who, work these for the military and, have spent our careers devoted to this and then are now trying to write and advocate, what would you say would be the best things we could do to reach out, help inform members, their staffs, particularly in those places where they don't have, a STRATCOM or a Pantex or a, Los Alamos or, one of the major missile bases? For those folks, it's not a pressing concern, but how do we still sort of speak to them in a way that's compelling?
Well, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about a while ago. You have to start with why it's important, how it does connect to things that they care about. And if you're a member of the Armed Services Committee or Defense Appropriations or Foreign Affairs, even if you don't have one of the facilities in your district, you have an interest in the global geostrategic security situation. And nuclear weapons, nuclear deterrent is the foundation upon which all our other efforts are based. We can do this or that with some conventional systems, but it's not really going to matter very much if we mess up on the nuclear side, obviously. So I do think starting with why it matters and how it has changed just in recent years, partly because of Putin's conventional inadequacies threatening to use nukes, partly because the Chinese have taken a dramatically different turn that complicates our calculations. It complicates the India-Pakistan situation. It just adds so much difficulty to the international situation. I think kind of that context is really what members of Congress and especially their staffs need to hear, because we all tend to get kind of focused on what's in front of us. We need to be reminded about that bigger picture and how it fits together. Yeah,
that's a great point. And so if you were to say, do this, would it be write op-eds in the Hill? Would it be do podcasts? Would it be go on TV? Would it be show up to talk to folks in their offices? What specific things do you think would be the wisest allocation of time and resources to try to help folks understand, the nuclear issues?
Yeah. Well, the obvious answer is all of that. You can influence the direction of opinion with op-eds and podcasts and TV appearances and so forth. It does make a difference. If, however, you can find a member of Congress who can really make a difference and get to their staff or something, then that can have disproportionate effect. Because especially in the House, the Senate maybe not quite as much, but in the House, members tend to specialize in certain areas. And so if there's somebody who's respected who is saying, look, we got to really pay attention to this nuclear stuff, other members will tend to listen to them because they know they've done their homework on it. And you can't do your homework on everything. You got to pick and choose your issues. And so that's why what you and I were talking about, focusing in on those folks who have the potential, either are or have the potential to be the most influential in swaying other members' opinion, that can be helpful. But don't neglect the public part of it, because they also have to listen to their folks back home.
Sure.
And the questions they get at town halls and all of that can also play a role.
Now, we're talking about influence in members, and the arms control community is, relative to those who advocate for modernization and a robust nuclear deterrent. Arms control is much, much larger. They're much better funded. For every one organization like ANWA or, another organ, NIP, the National Institutes of Public Policy, there's 4 or 5 organizations advocating for disarmament. And I sort of wonder how effective are these organizations in shaping, the executive branch, Congress, and with their thinking, with their writing. And part of the reason I ask this is because I often hear my colleagues who are on the other side advocate. They say, well, listen, we can replace nuclear capabilities with conventional capabilities. We can destroy the same targets. We can, we've got all these precision guided munitions. We don't need nukes. And I ask them, I said, well, don't you understand that Russia and China, they don't fear our ICBMs in Wyoming and Montana and North Dakota. They don't think we're going to, nuke them with ICBMs. What they fear is our conventional capabilities. That's what they're scared of. And so they build nukes to deter our conventional capabilities. And what you're telling me is you want to build more of what they fear and get rid of what they don't fear. And so I just wonder, how effective are they at shaping what Congress thinks with their advocacy? And to me, what are arguments that are really pretty poor arguments and not well grounded?
Yeah, it's interesting. If we were to chart the history of this, I think going back through the Cold War, there is a school of thought that says nukes bad, reducing them good, no matter what the consequences, and that arms control treaties are the goal within itself.
Yes.
I remember somebody wrote years ago, pieces of parchment are not what I want to stake my family's security on. And yet, a lot of these groups get their money, have their advocacy just to get a piece of paper signed. And then, by the way, they care less about whether it's actually complied with and verified and so forth. They just want the piece of paper. So I think so there are people in Congress who are still receptive to that message. But going back to what we talked about a while ago, in a lot of ways, we've had a strategic thought holiday since the end of the Cold War. We were focused on terrorism for all that time, and we really haven't had the discussion in public, in Congress. We haven't put the time and effort into these strategic nuclear issues. What makes sense? How do we best protect the country? We haven't really focused on that stuff much since the 90s. So that's my point, that we need really a reinvigoration of those things, so that it's not just kind of an emotional, oh, nukes are bad kind of reaction, that you really use your head and think about it. And one of the ways to do that is to remind everybody the success of America's nuclear deterrent since 1945 and what we have prevented from happening. And again, I think Putin is kind of opening the door for us to pay attention to that again, because just like you said, it's his conventional weakness that is leading him to threaten, whether he's, how serious it is a matter of debate, but he's threatening to use tactical nuclear weapons to make up for his conventional weakness. And if it were to happen, obviously, it presents us with some real difficulties on how to respond.
Yeah, and we're often, for those that advocate for modernization, we're often told, well, you're stuck in the Cold War. And having been in Congress for a quarter of a century, since the end of the Cold War, I sort of wonder, as you think about all the change you've seen in your 26 years, I wonder, as we've moved down 90%, 95%, our operation deployed strategic nuclear weapons there's 95% are gone. The entire tactical arsenal is gone. And so there was a recent critique by a arms control advocate named Joe Cirencione, or not Joe Cirencione, it was another fella. Drawing a blank all of a sudden. Tom Kalina. And he said, well, the Biden administration's NPR is just Cold War thinking. And I thought, I don't know how you can say that, my friend. It's, this is nothing like the Cold War. As you think about your time in Congress, do you really see that everybody's sort of stuck in the Cold War? Because that's not what I see, but maybe that's what you see.
No, and one of my rules of thumb is whenever anybody kind of tries to stick a label on something, be suspicious, because if you're just trying to win an argument by calling somebody your name or putting a label on it, there's probably more to find out by digging a little deeper. And I do think this. There is bipartisan concern about what China is doing. So as you pointed out, we're at 1,550 strategic weapons. We have come down so far that it has made it very enticing for them to equal us. And it has become public that they are well on the way to doing that much sooner than we ever expected. And so now, rather than just us and Russia, we have this third party, which complicates things tremendously. And as China goes up, and if you're India, you're saying, wait, I can get to 1,500 too. I better match them. And if you're Pakistan, you're saying, oh, if they're going to match them, and my point is, with all of these players jockeying around, it is a much more dangerous situation even than we faced during the Cold War. And part of the reason it's become dangerous is because we are down to so few nuclear weapons and so few choices in the kinds of nuclear weapons that we have. We've made it enticing for these other people to catch up. So it's not the Cold War. Actually, it's more dangerous in many ways. And so it's going to require the best of us in Congress, out of Congress, in the executive branch to try to develop a path to keep the country safe.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Whether you love him or whether you hate him, when Donald Rumsfeld said weakness is provocative, he was 100% correct.
Yeah, it's a fact of history.
Well, we are out of time. I want to thank former Congressman Mac Thornberry, former chairman of the House Armed Services Committee and longtime member of Congress who's been around to see the many changes we've seen since the end of the Cold War. And so thank you for coming on Nuclecast, It was enjoyable, and we hope you'll come back again soon.
Thanks, Adam. Appreciate you having me.
Well, as you well know, we just had a great interview with Mac Thornberry, former chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. It was a great show. I guess one of the big points I took away from it was that if you want to have influence on the Hill, focus on those members who specialize in nuclear issues and help them be even better at those issues, because they are widely respected and looked to by other members. And so that might be the best way to have influence and to help nuclear issues, get the understanding and the depth that they need. So that's my big takeaway. I'll always be interested to hear what you think.
This has been a production of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Our executive producer is Kimberly Charrington, and this episode has been engineered and mixed by David Krumthal. Follow the show on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at Nuclearcast. Listen, follow, and review the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.